Icke.com. And now, live from Manchester, England, here is Richie Allen.
My only guest tonight is a great friend and the biggest supporter of this radio programme. He's a multiple best-selling author and he's been on a journey for 25 years bringing information to people they otherwise wouldn't have got anywhere else. His most recent book, The Perception Deception, I have no problem saying it. With the utmost sincerity, possibly the best book I've ever read, a mammoth tome of nearly 1,000 pages of absolutely vital information. He's just overhauled his website. It's looking terrific, davidicke.com. Get on there now. As I said before, make the headline page your home page and you'll get that news every single morning when you get out of bed. It's an absolute pleasure, as always, to welcome live from the Isle of Wight, David Icke. How are you, my man? How are you? I'm
all right, Rich.
The website's looking great, by the way. Congratulations to all involved. It's looking really good.
Yeah, I'm very pleased with it, actually. We've made it, I think, easier to read and fresher, and I'm very pleased with the way it was put together. And thanks again to the people who did it, because they were very helpful in what they suggested.
Yeah, it needed a bit of spring cleaning, didn't it? I mean, all websites do eventually, but no, it's looking terrific now. It's striking, and it's great. It's very user friendly. Congratulations on it. Just before giving you a shout, I just ran very quickly through the major stories. Jana, of course, Tunisia, France. Although the France beheading thing is just gone now, nobody's talking about that. Greece and all of that. Where do you want to start, my friend? Where would you like to start?
Well, I think Tunisia would be the place, because what we're seeing now is the ante being upped, if you like. We're seeing the pattern that has been running for decades very clearly identifiable, of frightening and terrifying the public into acquiescence and submission to give their freedom away. And what we are seeing with that day, when we not only had Tunisia, but we had the French horrific incident, we had mass killings in Kuwait and in Syria, was a day designed specifically for mass trauma. I've written at length over the years about trauma-based mind control, in the sense of the way that people are put through, especially children, put through horrific trauma of many and various horrific kinds, to make their minds, what they call in the mind control trade, dissociate. And what trauma does is it makes people far more open to suggestion. I mean, this is a psychological fact, and trauma-based mind control is based on that understanding. But it doesn't just happen. It doesn't just work on an individual basis. Everything that can be individual can be collective. And what we saw on that day, and they're planning a lot more, was an attempt to mass traumatize the population on a mass scale, not least in the case of Tunisia in Britain, because of the great majority of people who were killed being British. The other thing you will see in these mass shootings and mass killings is that they're invariably done in a public place, or a place where the public, who are the target of the trauma, can identify with. So you see them in schools, because what they want from the people is to self-identify with the fact that it could have been their children. When something's happening in a faraway place and it's detached from you in terms of the people, in terms of the nationality of the people, in terms of your own country, what can happen is that the trauma, if you like, or the horror can be noted. Oh, isn't it terrible? oh, that's terrible what's happened, but it doesn't register so powerfully in terms of the depth of the trauma you feel. If you can identify with it, i.e., my kids could have been going to that school. That could have happened to my kids because they go to a school just like that. And of course, in the Tunisia example, it's a beach. It's people chilling out. It's people on holiday. It's people lying on sunbeds. And of course, vast numbers of people every year all over the Europe and the countries of the tourist countries as we speak. There will be vast numbers of people from European countries, from Britain, etc., who will be lying on sunbeds. And of course, there'll be others who have done that. And all these little connections mean that they can self-identify very powerfully with that event. That could have been me. That could have been my family. And the more you can make it personal in that way, the more you traumatize people, the more you open people to suggestibility. And the reason for that, of course, in the individual mind control, is the suggestibility is then to suggest courses of actions which you want them to carry out on your behalf. On the collective level, the public level, it's the suggestibility that what should happen now to protect you from what has just happened so it doesn't happen to you. And this whole subject of mind control comes into this situation on two major levels. One is what I've just described, the traumatic effect on the population, the observers, the people involved, and etc., the public. But also, we had a gunman, and it's again classic, Richie, when you go through these events, whether they be people going crazy with guns in schools or shopping malls or beaches. You have a situation where this kid, that's all he was not an extreme Muslim, didn't even wear a beard.
No, he didn't.
He loved breakdancing. He was a big football fan, supported Real Madrid, fashion conscious, was a student who talked about his future. He was described as polite, a peaceful man, respectful. His relatives met him very recently, the last few days before this attack, said he was just normal. And then he does this. And his father was quoted as saying, "These people ruined my son's brain with horrid thoughts and ideas. They broke him."
They must have been quick then, David.
And another, well, not necessarily. Another relative said he must have been brainwashed because they couldn't identify with what he did compared with what they experienced through his life.
Yeah.
And the reason it doesn't have to be quick is because, one of the things that I did for years and years and years, from the latter part of the 90s right into the next decade, was study around the world mind control and how it works and what it's capable of. And it really was one of the things that was so important in understanding how all these things work, because you can put behavior traits, what you want them to do, into their mind long before they do it. But you put it, they create what they call alters, as in altered states. They're like compartments, and they create this honeycomb mind, which is hidden through hypnotic keys and codes. I've sat in a therapist's front room in London, just off Harley Street, the famous doctor's street for the private medical profession. And I watched a woman, her name was Carol, who had been through trauma-based mind control, and horrifically so. and I saw 7, 8 completely different personalities manifest, including that of a child, a small baby. Um, uh, Carol herself, was a lovely woman, really nice, kind, peaceful lady. One of the personalities that was brought out was pure, undiluted evil. And they were brought out simply because over a very, very long period of time, the work of the therapist had elicited through various techniques what the codes were to trigger these different personalities. And if you met Carol, you thought you'd meet in Carol. But then suddenly the code, I sat there and I watched the therapist deliver the code. And this woman changed in a flash into a completely different personality. So it is perfectly explainable and understandable that this gunman had one personality to almost everyone else he saw. These are not just relatives that are describing his personality that they experienced. These are friends, these are neighbors, these are people he met in the coffee shop. But suddenly, bingo, suddenly this guy goes out and does this. And, you know, when you look at mind control, and people think it's kind of far out. What is mind control? If I can get you to believe something that isn't true because of how I tell it to you and what I tell you about it, I have controlled your mind. I have controlled your perceptions. I have engineered and manipulated your perceptions. So even on that basic level, what are the media doing, Richie? Every day they are mind controlling the population by giving them information, emphasizing certain information, and suppressing the alternative to that information to get people's perceptions to believe that information is true, and that's what happened. It's mind control. What we're talking about here is an advanced version of it. And I saw this report on the BBC today, and it was basically saying people going on holiday around the sunshine beaches of Europe, nowhere is safe. Nowhere is safe. No, you can't say anywhere is safe now. And that is what this whole setup has been about, to make people feel unsafe, to make people feel uneasy, so that they will be open, suggestible to ways of, in their mind, protecting them from what they have been manipulated to feel uneasy about. And what we're looking at is a very simple structure. You have a core, let's call it in the shadows, a hidden group that has passed through the generations. I've gone into this in great detail in the books, fine detail. And if you can imagine that core that you never see, which is manipulating the direction of human society to a global fascist dictatorship, where 24/7 everyone is under constant surveillance and control. You take that core, and from one side, you come away from that core and you go through secret societies and intelligence agencies and the upper echelons of the military. And then you go down into ISIS, into Al-Qaeda, into Boko Haram, and all these other so-called terrorist groups. I say so-called because the official story is that they have spontaneously emerged. They have not. They have been created. And then from that core, that same core that's behind them, you come down the other side and you go through secret societies and you go through intelligence agencies, etc. And then you go down into governments, government agencies, national military, European Union, all that stuff, and down into the system in general. So from that same core, you are creating the problem, and from the other side, you are offering the solutions. And this is the way it's played. And so all that's happening here in a simple on a simple level is that one aspect of this cabal is terrifying people, and the other aspect of this cabal is telling them what we must do to protect them from what they're terrified of. And that will be, as it always is, taking away more and more freedom, more and more surveillance, and all that follows every time. And it's a myth that comes out of these things, and it happened again this time, and they tried to sell it this way, that these people, like this Tunisian gunman, like the guy in France in the beheading attack, that they are lone wolves. I read a quote in a newspaper that said he was talking about the Tunisian gunman. He was the kind of lone wolf terror attack which intelligence agencies most fear. But it wasn't. They're not lone wolves. They are patsies. They are people who are simply put into place to carry out something. And they will have no idea, ultimately, who they're carrying it out for, because of this compartmentalization of this whole structure. And so when you look at Tunisia, France, the Syrian attacks on the same day, the suicide bomber in Kuwait, all on the same day, this was a day of attempted massive trauma on the global population, and particularly the British population, because of the number of British people involved. And it's a classic. And if people take these attacks in isolation, then they're missing the point, because Tunisia and all the rest was just the latest progression in something that goes back not only to 9/11, but through 9/11 and way back before then. It's an age-old technique. And what's interesting also is that this ISIS is supposed to be an extreme Muslim operation. It's not an extreme Muslim operation at all. It's just extreme, and it's meant to be extreme. And the reason that we've had this ISIS beheading people, we've had them burning people alive, and all these other horrors, is because of what I was talking about earlier. It's all about trauma. The more horrific the action, the more trauma in the observer. But what interests me is we supposedly have an extreme Muslim operation here. And apart from killing Europeans, only people they're killing are other Muslims, other Arab people. Why does not an extreme Muslim organization, which with apparently such military power and firepower and influence in terms of carrying out terrorist attacks, why does it never attack Israel?
Yeah, it's a huge question. Yeah.
Why does it never attack Israel? And this is the reason. The United States, NATO in general, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, all these apparently unconnected organizations, most of them anyway, apparently unconnected, are all on the same side, and they're all behind this. And if we try to understand the world, and we try to understand these events from the perspective of Saudi Arabia is controlled by Saudi royals, and Israel is controlled by the Netanyahu government, United States is controlled by, whoever's in power, and all this, we are losing the plot. We'll never understand what's happening.
No.
The people that apparently are in power in these countries and NATO and all these other connected organizations are merely gophers and place people for the real power in the unseen, which controls them all to a common end. And never can you see it more blatantly than what has happened in recent days.
And the reaction to it. You take a sip of water there. Let me read a few tweets. Understandably, I've been hammered on Twitter already. I suppose if you put hashtag the Richie Allen Show on Twitter, you'll be able to see the tweets coming in. There's been a load of emails as well. I'll run through a few of them very quickly. Gary in Scotland, I've said it before, it's Orwell's Emmanuel Goldstein, the never-seen terrorist thrown after us, or thrown at us even time after time. Spot on, says Gary. Emlyn says, belief system, believe. Lie, basically. I believe, we believe what other men tell us without seeing it with our own eyes. Martin was on to say, Martin Noakes, how are you, Martin? Paul McKenna. Darren Brown, great examples, very clever. They can do it. You can see them doing it on a TV show. Lisa, this is a really interesting tweet from Lisa. Thanks for sending it in, Lisa. My mother-in-law returned from Tunisia. She was 175 miles away from the shooting, and she was asked by armed police for any video footage of the attack, says Lisa. How interesting is that? Daniel was on to talk about mind control. Has it happened at government level in the UK? I've only ever heard about it in the US, he says. David might want to get into that. And Angela was on to say, how are you doing, Angela? It sounds very much like the brainwashing thing, like the pilot of the recent crash. She must be talking about Germanwings, whose breathing didn't change as he was nosediving to the ground, possibly hypnotised or brainwashed, says Angela. And just before David comes back in, so I get through a few of these. Let me go on. Where are we? Andrea was saying, is it images they want us to get used to? Images. I find the more I watch, the more I become used to it. But because I know that, it won't change the way I value human life. It merely stops them having the desired effect. I think what she's saying is, are they trying to desensitise us to it? I don't think they are. They want you in a permanent state of terror, David has said, and I completely agree with that. Karen was on to say about Theresa May. I wonder whether she flew to Tunisia on board of a discount airline company, or was she flown in on a private jet paid by the taxpayer so she could show her support and tell her lies as quickly as possible, says Karen. And there's loads more, Icke, but I'll let you back in there because I know you have one or two comments, one or two points you want to make based on those tweets. What about Lisa? 175 miles away the mother-in-law was. She came back to Britain and she was asked at Heathrow, did she have any video footage? How interesting.
Yeah, the thing about the mind control is that, a lot of my research has been in America. I mean, we've got the infamous MK Ultra mind control operation, which actually came out publicly in the 1970s and then was obviously suppressed in terms of its full magnitude. And MK Ultra was actually created by the Nazis that were brought out of Nazi Germany at the end of the war and taken to the United States and South America. They, in Nazi Germany, had advanced understanding of mind control, trauma-based mind control, as they did of many other things, technologically, for instance. And they were brought to America under something called Project Paperclip or Operation Paperclip. And indeed, they set up NASA. It's interesting how close NASA is to Nazi. And they called it MK Ultra, but they mind control ultra, in other words. But they spelt control with a K, not a C, out of deference to the German spelling of control, because of all the Nazis that were involved in it. Joseph Mengele, of course, the angel of death in the concentration camps, was taken to the United States, and he continued his mind control and genetic experiments and trauma and horror under the name Dr. Green. I've met people that actually were traumatized and horrifically treated by him. But although America is a big center for mind control, it absolutely happens in Britain. I mean, Britain is the Oh no, we've got no power. We used to have a big empire, but we know it's Little Britain now. And that kind is you watch the little countries, watch the little countries near the big countries. One of the biggest centers for global manipulation, certainly in the Americas, is Canada. Canada, no one ever mentions Canada in any kind of volume compared with the United States, but so much goes on in Canada. So much goes in Austria when the big country next to it, Germany, is what everyone talks about. And Britain is a major, major center for this globally for reasons I explain in the books. And certainly mind control, trauma-based mind control is extremely advanced and widely used in this country. And the other thing that is also connected into all this, because what we're moving towards now, what's been happening over the decades, indeed, if you go back far enough, over thousands of years, but over the decades of the 20th century to now, is that more and more power has been centralized, more and more trauma is being imposed, because we're going somewhere. I mean, this whole thing that we're talking about is not some random idea that, oh, we'll do this now, and oh no, well, let's do that now. This is coldly calculated, and people would be staggered how far advanced this is projected. What is happening now was not decided now. It wasn't decided yesterday. It was decided a long time ago. Not necessarily exactly the same, that beach, no. But the theme of the trauma. And so this is why people like George Orwell, real name Eric Blair, could write 1984, published in 1948, and be so incredibly accurate. This is why Aldous Huxley could write Brave New World, published in 1932, and be so incredibly accurate, because they were writing from a knowledge of the projected agenda. And so these things are planned in a long way in advance. And it's an understanding of it. I mean, it goes so deep because, you know, if you go deep enough in the rabbit hole, you're not even operating in the world of humans. But it's an understanding that if you do this, this is what you get. It's if you like, an evil use of the law of cause and effect. And so they have studied human psychology, human emotional response on a very, very deep level. There are documents that detail this. And they know that if they do A, they will get B. To them, it is like typing something in a computer, and they know that when they press enter, what's going to happen on the screen. This is what they're doing. So it's a case of, we need this reaction so we can do this. So what do we have to do to get that reaction? That's what's going on. It's so systematic, and it's a massive psychological attack on the human collective mind. And this is why we've got to stop reacting. We've got to stop responding to the enter button in the way that people normally do. Instead of reacting, we've got to take a deep breath and let's look at it again. Simple question: who benefits? Who benefits from what's just happened? Who benefits from Tunisia? Well, the tourist industry of Tunisia doesn't. British people on the beach don't. Other people who would want to be on beaches having a holiday and chilling out haven't. When you break it down, the only people who have benefited from what has happened, the only people that have benefited from ISIS and Al-Qaeda or the fear of it and all that, are those that want to change the face of human society to impose more and more control, surveillance, etc., on the basis of the traumatic event. They're the only people that are benefiting, and that's why it's being done. And this is how people need to start looking at this. I mean, when you see the reactions of people to this, let's just go and bomb them all. Let's have ground troops. Let's send ground troops. Let's invade. Well, this is another big point, because this is an agenda for the subjugation of the entire human race. It means that in the end, it's all connected to that agenda. And it's not just one strand where we do this, we get that. It's also, we do this, we get lots of that. We get lots of benefits from it. And this brings me to the other big running story at the moment, which is the migrants. The migrants who are coming out of North Africa and the Middle East into Europe, who are every day and night trying to get into lorries, trucks at Calais and the French ports to get across on the ferry into Britain. And of course, they are talking now, I see, about building a big wall to stop them getting in.
A big wall, yeah.
Yeah, and this is what happens. If you are a magician and you're doing the trick with your left hand, you want people looking at your right hand, because that's the way you do the trick. If they're looking at your left hand, they'll see it. And so it's all about diversion. And the media are wonderful, players in this diversion technique by simply reporting the official line of everything without questioning and without pointing out the connecting facts that need to be included to get any understanding of a situation. So the diversion is to focus everything on the migrants. How do we stop the migrants getting in? And then you've got the European Union having these meetings of the heads of state saying, what do we do about all these migrants coming across the Mediterranean into Italy and Greece? What do we do? And the diversion is from this. Why the hell are they doing that? Why would you get into a boat with your family, with your kids, and go across the Mediterranean on a journey that has a very good chance of killing you all? Why would you do that unless you were absolutely desperate? Now, next question, why are they absolutely desperate? Well, because out of Libya they're coming, because this was the situation before this systematic undermining of the Middle East and North Africa began. You had Iraq, wasn't perfect. Saddam Hussein seriously wasn't perfect, but it was a stable situation. Libya, Gaddafi wasn't perfect in any way, but it was a stable situation. Syria with Assad was stable. Again, not perfect. And if you are trying to change something, one of your worst nightmares is stability. You don't want stability because that's very difficult to manipulate and change. You need instability, you need chaos. And so we invade Iraq, instability. We invade on, like Iraq, a massive lie in Libya with he's killing his own people, when who the Gaddafi regime was responding to were actually people armed and funded and trained by the NATO countries and the West in general. Then you had the Syria with the rebels, many of whom were moved out of Libya to do that to Syria once Gaddafi was removed. And so you suddenly created this mass upheaval, this mass instability and chaos and mayhem. And so you went from a stable Libya to a Libya now that is just a mass of intertribal warfare and violence, which Gaddafi, for all his faults, was holding together and holding at bay. And so you are a family, you've got kids, and you're surrounded by violence and death and destruction. and violent imposition by mad people. What are you going to do? You're going to try to get out of there. And why are you trying to get out of there? Because of a situation created by the same European and North American powers that are now holding their hands up and saying, what are we going to do about this problem? When you create a situation like you just have done in Tunisia, the economy of Tunisia is going to collapse.
It's going to be in a
Who on
devastating
earth is
state.
going to go there on holiday after that? And why? And what are the consequences of that? Well, there's going to be people in Tunisia who up to this point have been quite happy to stay in Tunisia are going to start looking elsewhere. You've got all the thing with ISIS and the horrors going on there and the horrors in Syria. You know, Syria, according to figures I was looking at today, 10 million people have been displaced in Syria because of that. Again, so rebels and ISIS created and supported covertly by the West and the NATO countries. More than 1 million of them are in Lebanon, a small country, 600,000 in Jordan, 250,000 are displaced in Iraq. Syrian people displaced are in Iraq, 1.6 million in Turkey, and on it goes. Others, of course, are heading for Europe. And if you were in the middle of that ISIS situation in Syria, what would you do?
You couldn't stay there. I mean, it's obvious. Yeah.
You would try to get somewhere else.
You do anything, yeah.
Now, if we go back, Rich, to what I was saying about this systematic cause and effect, when you create mayhem and violence and upheaval in North Africa and the Middle East, you know what the effect of that cause is going to be. People are going to head for Europe in massive numbers. They're not going to go south into Africa because Africa's largely a mess because of powers like the United States and AFRICOM and all these terrorist groups and upheavals and violence that are going on there and the economic challenges that they're having. They're going to go north. And this is why they're literally, Richie, if you look at it, they're literally between the devil and the deep blue sea. Do we stay in this horror that's being created by these mad people, or do we try to get across the Mediterranean in great danger and try to get out of here? And so what this manipulation does is it plays one part of humanity off against another. And what it's doing is creating two, if you like, victims of their actions, but it's playing those victims off against each other. So the people that have been had their lives brought into upheaval and mayhem by this hidden hand, then start fighting among themselves over the situation that they face. So now we've got, of course, a great animosity towards the peoples coming out of the Middle East and North Africa into Europe, and yet they are victims of what happened in the same way as those people that are getting flooded by people that they can't cope with. It's playing one side of humanity off against another. And one great thing that we can do, again, by understanding the dynamic of what's going on, is to realize that both groups are victims of this hidden hand and stop fighting with them and see the situation for what it is, an attempt to create upheaval, mayhem and violence in Europe. What they've done in Africa, because this is a global agenda. This is not about just creating a global fascist state in Africa and Asia and all that stuff. It's about the world. And thus what they've done to other countries through Europe and through the European powers, they're now wanting to do to Europe itself. This is what they're doing, and in the same way, they're doing it economically as well, with bringing the European nations more and more into economic turmoil, as they have other countries, because that again creates a massive problem to which they can offer solutions, which is more and more control of global finance and the nations and people's lives as a result. This is all connected, and
planned for years, as you said. I must jump in there and say, by the way, when we were at television in London at TPV, David made a series of films called David Icke the Dot Connector, and they're all still available on davidicke.com. There are links to them, and now more than ever, they're very well worthwhile watching. David, we're just about to come up on news at the top of the hour, so I've got to, for TRE and Fab, I've got to get out. When we come back, there's more than a few tweets, people making comments, a few questions for you as well. But I know that you want to get into, for me, an issue that I never shut up about, the financial situation in Europe, particularly Greece. And there's a lot of questions for you about trial of the facts and Lord Greville Janner. So you're going to stay with us. You're going to have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or something for about 6 or 7 minutes. Then we'll come back. How does that sound?
All right, Rich, no problem.
Legend. David is on the Isle of Wight. He's talking to us live. It's 3.5 minutes to the top of the hour. He's going to go and get a cup of coffee. I'm going to disconnect from him, is what I'm going to do, so I can take in the news. When we come back, I'll get through more of your questions, more of your tweets and comments. We'll talk Greville Janner, and we'll also we might talk fracking and the stance taken against that by a council in Lancashire. And of course, we will talk the situation in Greece as well. I'm not going to get through all the questions that have come in for David. I'll do my best to get through them. He'll be back again in the near future anyway. Tonight, we're specifically focusing on 3-4 massive news stories over the last few days. Tunisia, France, Greece, which we're going to get into now in a second, and of course, Greville Janner. Before we move back to David, who's standing by now, which is great, and we'll get him back on in a second. Just to remind you, the programme is funded and is owned by you, the listener. So please go to richieallenshow.com/donate and make a contribution to keeping this programme going and ongoing. Remember, that gets the radio show and the podcast. It's got nothing to do with the television show. I have to keep reiterating that. All of us work for free on that. There's no money involved in that. But your donations at richieallenshow.com/donate keep the radio show ongoing. Welcome back, David Icke.
Thanks, Rich.
Have you wet your whistle?
I have.
Good man.
It's very nice. I just wanted to mention something quickly before we
go ahead.
Somewhere else. Is a lot of people listening to this will know of an alleged letter by a very high Freemason in the United States called Albert Pike to another major, shall we call him, Illuminati asset called Giuseppe Mazzini in 1871, in which he described 3 world wars that would come. And what he said about the Third World War, involving basically the Middle East and the Arab and what is now Israel countries, is moving just as he said. And there's one line in it where he's talking about the Third World War, which really I think is very applicable to what we've been talking about. He said this, that at the time of the Third World War, we shall unleash the nihilists and atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. And the dictionary definition of nihilism, or one of them, is a total rejection of established laws and institutions, anarchy, terrorism, and other revolutionary activity, total and absolute destructiveness. And if that doesn't describe this whole ISIS operation, then what does? And
yeah, that's right.
The point is that they're trying to create a situation of so much trauma and so much horror that humans will switch off and become subservient and docile in the face of the horror and in the face of what they're faced with.
So Andrea is onto something then, David, when she says that ultimately they want us desensitized to it. She might be onto something.
Yeah, well, I think there's different levels to that. First of all, they do want to desensitize people to what they do. They do want to desensitize people to war, in the sense of bombing Libya on the pretext of protecting the civilians from violence, because that allows them to do that. The more sensitive people are to it, and the more undesensitized they are, the more they will challenge those things. So there is a level of desensitizing the public to what these mad people are doing. But this is another reason why to pass through that desensitization, if you like, is to target situations that people will self-identify with. You see, if this is not, the case with a lot of people, if in fact almost everyone, I would have think, listening to this program, but in the case of a vast number of people, it is. There is a tremendous difference in the level of trauma between NATO countries bombing Libya, where most people have never been, who they know nothing about, know nobody there, and what happened to British tourists on a beach while lying on sunbeds. That they are completely different levels of trauma, and they absolutely do want to desensitize people from the Libya type events, because that allows them to go about their invasions and bombings with least amount of challenge.
Yeah, and it works, doesn't it? Because I can't, we all have circles of friends, and you just can't get people interested in it,
Well, I saw an interview today, Rich, with somebody who has relatives that were involved in the horror in Tunisia. And he actually said, you see all these things happen around the world and these terrorist events, but, you think, oh, that's terrible, but it doesn't hit you. But when it's this close, it hits you. And that's a completely different level of trauma. And what they want to do, therefore, and this is a progression, is to bring as much of that trauma into people's own environment, into people's own communities, own countries. And this is why when they talk about, ISIS said they're going to do this, they're going to do that, in Europe or America, what that really means is that cabal that I talked about, that core in the hidden, is planning to do that. And of course, the people it uses to do it are just people who are either subject to the kind of mind control that I've been talking about, or they are naturally psychopathic and just love the horror, trauma, and violence that they engage in. I mean, what is ISIS except a bunch of absolute psychopaths? And they are psychopathic gophers controlled by the mega master psychopaths in the hidden who are orchestrating these things. So they want to bring it to Europe because they want to increase the trauma. This is unfortunately, because we'd like a very different world, but this is what is happening. And unless we understand it, well, we're going to be played like a violin.
While we're talking, and we're going to talk about Greece now, my cousin, my great friend and cousin in Ireland, Martin, is watching Alexis Tsipras, who's on Greek television. And obviously, they're whacking the old subtitles up there, and Martin is following it. And Tsipras says the institutions were not interested in finding common ground, but rather to impose extreme measures. He went on to say, and I paraphrase because there's a lot here, that basically the Greek government doesn't want to exit or break up the Eurozone, but we have to do whatever we can to ensure that Greek people survive. And I've been all over this in recent weeks. I've taken a real interest in it because something back at my Spain days I spent a lot of time talking about, and talking to you about, it must be said on the radio over the years, that Tsipras and his pal Varoufakis, in my opinion, were put in there to create the illusion of dissent, when really all along there was never going to be any Greek exit or any Greek breaking up of the Eurozone. They were going to sign a deal eventually. And whatever comes out of this referendum on Sunday, in all likelihood, the Greek people will vote yes, because most of them, when they're polled, and they are polled at least twice a week, want to stay within the Eurozone. This is madness. And again, something you've been writing about for well over a decade and a half now, this financial debt slavery, this European Central Bank, IMF, central banking slavery. How are you reading this at the moment?
Well, what I would suggest that we're seeing with this apparent majority, quite a big majority in Greece, to stay in the EU and stay in the euro despite everything, is one of the aspects of this perception program is mummy daddy, and to use that instinct that children have to basically look to their parents for safety and protection. And this happens on many levels, and that can also apply with adults to the state and the status quo. The fear of leaving the status quo, whatever it is, because of fear of the unknown. I mean, there is a well-documented situation that you find where women, wives who are battered by their husbands, are asked why they stay, those that do. And one of the things is they fear what they were going to do if they left. How could they cope alone or whatever? In other words, even in that horrific situation, there's a fear of the unknown by changing the status quo. And what is happening in Greece is kind of symbolically like that in this sense. The status quo they're talking about, in that sense, a wife being beaten up by her husband constantly, in the Greek situation is an economic catastrophe that is so appalling, so horrific in terms of the suffering of the people, through lack of money and all the things that come from that how on earth could it be any worse? Just saying we're getting out of here, we're going to do something else, we're going to try something else. But the status quo is still so ingrained that people still say, no, we don't want austerity, that we don't like that, understandably, but we're going to stay, we want to stay in the European Union and stay in the euro. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
The reason you're in austerity is because of the European Union, the European Central Bank. Yes, to a certain extent, the behavior of Greece economically, but also because you're in the euro. I mean, over the weekend, this idiot who is held up as this business guru, Richard Branson, was arguing against Britain coming out of the European Union. And he was asked a very good question. But you and people like Tony Blair and Kenneth Clark and Nick Clegg and Confederation of British Industry, all these people, you said it would be crazy not to join the euro, that there would be kind of economic terrible consequences if Britain didn't join the euro. And he was asked, given the state of the euro and Greece and all these other countries, do you stand by that? And he tried to defend it by saying it wouldn't have changed anything. In fact, it could have been better. I mean, it's ludicrous. These are the very same people now saying we must stay in the EU. euro was created for a simple reason: to wipe out all the individual national currencies that were there before. Because the more you can get currencies in a state of fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer, the more those that control the currencies that remain have control over the people and their choices and everything that comes from money, which is virtually everything in this world that this cabal has created. So the more they got rid of the lira, the franc, the Deutschmark, all these sovereign currencies were replaced by one. So now you don't have to manipulate and control all the different currencies. You only have to control one to control the finances of every country that's in the euro. And so by bringing Greece into the euro, and from there, out of their currency, suddenly Greece were under the control, not of people in Greece, but of people that control the euro. And you have a situation where Goldman Sachs were very clearly exposed for a horrible, grotesque manipulation, not only manipulation of the figures so that Greece would qualify to join the euro, but then betting, this is Goldman Sachs, betting on the consequences of it and making money from winning the bet because they knew what the consequences were going to be.
That's right, yeah.
Consequences for Goldman Sachs, zilch. Consequences for the people of Greece, catastrophe. And what we are looking unfold here, and we're going back to that cabal that's behind the terrorism and the ISIS and the trauma and all that. We're seeing the progression to what I describe in the Perception Deception as the Hunger Games society, where you have a tiny, tiny, less than 1% controlling everything. You have a police state of classic violent, psychopathic people in law enforcement, enforcing the status quo of the less than 1% controlling everything and keeping the masses in a state of poverty and subservience. Now, this police state, to a large extent, a very, very large extent, is being installed and justified as a protection against terrorism. So you can see why the ISIS, why Tunisia, why beheadings in France, why 9/11, you can see why they have been instigated to justify more and more surveillance, more and more control, more and more police state imposition. So there's that strata of the Hunger Games society there to see, the police state, because of all that. If you want to put people in poverty, then, and you want the masses in poverty who are not in the less than 1% eventually, then you have to part people who at the moment are doing okay, who maybe from most people's point of view have a lot of money, but are not part of the less than 1%. You want that too. You want it all. You want the masses to have nothing. And by the masses, I mean today, the people that call themselves middle class, the people that call themselves upper middle class, people who think they own their own homes and they're living an okay life, they want them as well. And to do that, you need to crash the value of their wealth. And this is what the crash of 2008 was about. And it wasn't a one-off. It wasn't, we're going to do it with that crash. It's going to be, again, a progression. But you look at the phenomenal transfer of wealth from the people through governments to the less than 1% in bank bailouts, etc., that went on. It was a crash that has pushed on the Hunger Games society in great leaps. And what we're seeing with the Greek example, but it's happening in Britain, it's happening everywhere. I think one of the people who have sent in a question, I think you mentioned earlier, is that when it comes to facing any, I would suggest strongly, engineered economic crisis, you don't go for the banks that cause the crisis because they're connected to the less than 1%. You go for the public in austerity programs. And what are austerity programs doing? They are creating more and more people in the slavery, poverty-stricken masses that you want to create. And so in the case of Greece, of course, the European Central Bank and the European Commission don't want to find a way of removing austerity in Greece. They want austerity in Greece. They want austerity in Britain. They want austerity everywhere because they're moving towards this Hunger Games society in which austerity will be a way of life for the masses of the people. This is what is happening. And so there is no way that Greece is going to get rid of austerity while they're in the European Union and while they're in the euro, because they are controlled by people that for which austerity is an agenda to impose, not something to find a way of removing. You look in this country, in Britain, you're seeing austerity programs on the people, but the government reprivatizing a bank, which they bailed out with taxpayers' money, at a loss of £7 billion. And so that serves the interests of the less than 1%, because what they've done is bailed out that echelon of society which created the crash, saved the bank. Now they're selling it back into the private sector, i.e. the people and forces that crashed it, at a 7 billion loss. A 7 billion loss to whom? The taxpayer, the people. This is what we're seeing. The common denominator, Rich, in all this economic mayhem that's unfolded, is the people get crushed and those that created the problem get richer. It's not an accident. It's by design.
By design, yeah. I'm going to read a few comments now before we get on. Bertha in Spain has asked about, can David talk about the fight back that has taken place and how effective that is now having? He'll get to that, I'm sure, in a couple of minutes. Lorenz is listening in South Africa. How are you, Lorenz? Thanks for listening. Talking to friends in Germany, she says it's obvious they have been brainwashed to think the Greek economic problems are due to the Greeks are lazy and they don't want to work. Colin, listening in San Pedro in Spain. How are you, Colin? I think the problems in Greece have been brought about as a test or a trial for larger areas in the future. They will never allow Greece revert back to their country, says Colin. And Michael on Facebook, he's just emailed me, or not emailed me, messaged me on Facebook. This is interesting because I've been lamenting this myself in the last couple of weeks. Not that I'm any great defender of the English language. I might have an English degree, which I do, but I'm not the greatest, I'm not the most eloquent speaker of all time myself. But he says, does Michael, and this has pissed me off, David, terms like Grexit, Referendum, Brangelina, Brad and Angelina, these terms, these words being used by presenters and journalists who are supposed to have a command of the English language, it's almost, Michael says, like they're brainwashing people into thinking it's not serious. He's right, isn't he?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, we both worked in the mainstream media,
Yeah.
and of course, at the level of the mainstream media where the big decisions are made and directions are decided, there will be people who are representatives of this hidden cabal in terms of ownership, etc. But and there will be journalists, very, very few compared with the number of journalists, who do have at least some idea of what is going on and are in support of it, are working for it to happen. But the vast majority of journalists serve this agenda through pure, undiluted ignorance. And one of the biggest diseases of the human race is the arrogance of ignorance. It's the ignorance of what's happening in the world, because all you're doing is taking the official version of everything and repeating it. But the arrogance that even though you're doing that, you still know it all, and you still know what there is to know, and you can therefore reject things that you haven't researched in any way, shape, or form, simply because they're different to what you have been told is reality. And so, I remember when I was at the BBC, when I first joined the BBC, there was still some substance. There was still some substance in news reporting and current affairs reporting. There was still some substance in interviews where people were able to have a little time to make their point and be challenged on their point. And then out of the United States, I remember it happening. It was horrible as a journalist to have to work in that environment suddenly. It came from America, and it was called soundbite journalism. And everything had to be short, everything had to be superficial. And increasingly what's happened is that you have you notice this almost never happened when I was started out in broadcast journalism. You now have the newsreader interviewing the reporter at the
That's right.
event about what's happening and what the truth about that event is. Now, that reporter who just stands there looking confident about what they're saying has got his information from overwhelmingly 99.9% of the time official sources. So the media is an arrogantly ignorant, overwhelmingly, there are honorable exceptions, vehicle for selling this agenda. So it's what superficial journalism needs by its nature is black and white. Everything's black and white. There's no shades of grey. Shades of grey take too long to explain. You've got 3 minutes to tell us this story, mate. Don't get into shades of grey. So you have the good guys, bad guys, black and white kind of so-called journalism.
That's right.
And therefore it's so simple. Greece, it's basically Greece's fault, and it's all presented in black and white. When does anyone in mainstream journalism ask the question, why is there austerity?
Absolutely.
On the basis of not having enough units of exchange, which are merely figures on a screen. We talk about the European Central Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, and loans to countries like Greece that they have to pay back, otherwise they default. What are they lending? They're lending non-existent figures on a screen called credit that has never, does not, and will never exist. Third world debt, which crushed and crucified great chunks of the world and still is doing so, was debt on money that has never, does not, and will never exist. It's another mind game. It's another illusion, another confidence trick. And because we have a media that simply is so ignorant of what's really going on and the world it's reporting, but arrogant enough to dismiss any alternatives, it means that a basic truth, like the very structure, money, that controls the lives, including whether people continue their lives often, whether they eat, what choices they have or don't have, what they can do with their life and what they can't, is dictated by money that has never, does not, and will never exist, created and controlled by this same cabal in the shadows, which through that control is dictating virtually every aspect of human life, including the current catastrophe in Greece and other countries.
Before we come to a question from Vicky Haig related to child sex abuse, Vicky Haig has been on the programme before, incidentally, in case you're wondering. I don't mean you, David, I mean our listener is wondering whom she is. She's a former jockey. She had a very famous case here a few years ago involving a custody dispute with her ex-partner. She's asked the question, before we get into that, is that your greatest frustration, that you talk about so much, and you talk about the nature of reality and getting beyond the 5 cents reality and all of this really important information? But is it your greatest source of frustration that the most obvious brick within that wall, the financial system, is something that people either willfully decide not to embrace and understand, or, as you said, because of the behaviour of the media, they just genuinely don't get it? Because it's the thing that bugs me more than anything when I'm talking to people, when they dismiss it, is the financial system, because it's the most obvious thing, really.
Well, I've asked economic correspondents and people working in banks where their money comes from, how it's created. They can't tell you. They're lost. That basic thing, where does it come from? Or they'll tell you about the public sector borrowing requirement and all this stuff and all this kind of detail that they disappear up their own backside. But where does money come from? Do you know, I was talking to a man, it was some years ago now, quite a few years ago. And I've been writing about how money's created, or in fact, illusory created. And I was talking to this little group of people, I think it was in the West Country somewhere, not that it matters. And he was a bank manager, and he'd worked at a local bank as the bank manager for decades. And he'd come along to, this little event I was doing, which was kind of surprise, bank manager coming to listen to me. Well, what's going on? But what had happened and why he was there, he said he just retired about a year or two before. And he said, in the last year before I retired, the bank eased me into retirement by giving me a research project to do for the last year that I worked for the bank. He said, that was the first time I realized how money was created. And he looked at me with little boy eyes, I'll never forget it. And he said, there is no money, is there?
Yeah.
And this guy's been giving loans for decades to local people and businesses. So, you see, the compartmentalization. See, I talked the last time I was on, Rich, about the education system and the way the program starts from the womb and onwards. It's not taught in the schools how money is created, and therefore people go through their lives in complete ignorance of it. There'll be many people at some, like this bank manager, at levels of the financial system who do not understand the system that they are involved in. And from the general public's point of view, I've said, many times that one of the great defense mechanisms of this whole global conspiracy is that what's really happening is so stunningly different to what we're told is happening that people can't make that jump. And the way money is created, what it is so fantastic to people, most people, compared with what they're told it is, which is a real tangible thing and all that they're told. They can't make that jump. They can't. That could never be made. That can't be happening. Anyway, the newspapers would tell us. When do you? I mean, let's ask a simple question here. Look at all the newspapers in the world. Look at all the news programs and all the current affairs programs in the world. When is the last time anyone read anything or saw anything that explained what money is and how it's created? That's ridiculous, isn't it?
There's an economist in Spain called Edward Hugh. He's known as the Bonobo. He's a very famous economist. He used to write for the New York Times. I brought him on the radio show in Spain a few years back. In fact, you were on the same night, Icke. You were on the same night. You were on after him, actually, I remember. And I put it to him, and he said, well, he was very honest about it. He said, yeah, the system of currency we use, our coin, globally, whether it's euro or dollar, he said it's a faith-based currency, he said. It works because we believe in it. We believe in its, in its righteousness. And of course, that's, right. He's right to say that. And of course, me being me then, I just begun on this sort of journey, this sort of program. And I said to him, well, then effectively, a bunch of people then have basically made themselves the de facto rulers of the planet, haven't they? And you know what he said then? And Paul Flynn said it. And I believe that Paul Flynn means it. I believe he just can't see it. He went, no, it's not like that at all. And I said, it must be. It must bloody be that. If we have faith in this, if it isn't backed up by gold anymore, there's no gold standard, if it doesn't exist, and we have faith in it, well, of course, I said there are a bunch of people who are telling people what they can have, when they can have it, when they should print it. Of course, they're the de facto rulers of the planet. And he didn't want to know.
Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, again, let's take a breath and take a step back. If you control the creation of the unit of exchange we call money, which banks do by lending non-existent money called credit and charging interest on it, if you decide how much money is in circulation or how much money is not by how much you loan at any time and what interest rates you put on it, so you encourage people taking loans or you discourage them, then you control everything that money controls, in effect, which is choice, which is whether you eat, which is whether you have a home, which indeed is whether you even live. I mean, it's obvious. And what we see all the time, Richie, is complexity, an apparent complexity, used to hide simple truths. So you get most people, and I completely understand it, you'll get the economics correspondent come on, you'll get the financial report or whatever on the news, and they come on and they talk to most people complete bloody gobbledygook in terms of the jargon they use and what they say. And then you'll get a politician on and saying, we need to do something about the so-and-so and so-and-so. And what does that mean? It's all taken as if everyone would understand, that they want them to understand. And so people like, don't talk to me about finance, mate. It does my head in. Right. I don't understand it, all right? That's the idea. That's what complexity does. And when you break down the complexity, it's people lending money that doesn't exist, charging interest on it. If you don't pay back the money that doesn't exist plus interest is never created, by the way. So there's always more debt than there is money to pay debt, even non-existent credit money. And if they don't pay it back, then you get their wealth that does exist, their land, their business, the property, whatever. And in that way, the people that control the issuing of money, not governments, no, private banks, controlled ultimately by the same cabal, have sucked up the real wealth of the world. I mean, the latest figures I saw was that very soon, and it is very soon, because it's about 48% now, 1% of the people of the world own 48%, closing in on 50% of the world's wealth. Now, two things. The newspapers kind of report that, the media reports that. Two things. One, are they really telling me that has happened by chance, an accident, and random chance? And two, the way they've done it is by exchanging non-existent fresh air credit for real wealth and resources. And therefore, they have sucked up the wealth of the world doing this. Now, given that is and the effect of that on choice and human control globally, you can then understand why there has been such an effort and an ongoing effort to keep out of the mainstream what money is and how it's created. Presidents who have started issuing money interest-free without borrowing it from the private banking cartel, they have been assassinated, like Lincoln, for instance, who was bringing in the greenbacks, which were money not created by the banks. It's their worst nightmare. Governments creating their own money interest-free. Why are governments borrowing money at interest from private banks? They're the bloody government. But we're back to the cabal. We're back to this hidden core. They don't just control the terrorist groups to create the terror, which the governments they control can then offer the solutions to. They control the banks and the issuing of money. Thus, they control the choice. This is why, for instance, this just sums up, Richie. I saw this a few days ago. Not just the craziness of the world we live in, but the unbelievable inhumanity of it in terms of those that are directing it. NATO, the head of NATO, warned Greece not to reduce military spending with NATO in the light of the economic catastrophe in Greece. Don't reduce your contributions to NATO.
Imagine it, yeah. People are starving.
While people are looking through bins to try to survive and eat. And this is another thing, you see. It doesn't matter how much austerity there is. Doesn't matter. There's always money for war. How many times has a politician stood up and said, we can't go to war, we can't afford it? What they say is, we can't ensure you eat, we can't ensure you have a home, you can't ensure you have warmth because we can't afford it. And the reason for that extraordinary hypocrisy is because that inner core wants the war, it doesn't want those people to eat. And unless people start to understand the existence of this hidden hand, what its agenda is, what its methods of operation are, what its goals are, they'll never understand world events.
Simple as that. Absolutely right. I've said it time and time again to people. I've come, and of course I haven't, previously not understood much of what you were getting at over the years about the non-human element of it. I totally understand it now and I get it because I've seen it with my own eyes. I've got to bring in this Vicky Haig question.
Right.
We're 12 and a half minutes to the top of the hour. We got about 8 minutes left on this. And I mentioned Vicky there about 15 minutes ago and who she is. And people can Google Vicky Haig, read her story. She was on the programme a couple of times. She'll be back on again, no doubt, in the future. Talking about Greville Janner and the trial of the facts that he might have to, he won't be there, of course, it'll be in absentia. But she says, ask David this, why are children being given to paedophiles? I'm still intrigued by this, even though I know as much about it myself as I can. I'm still confused. Ask David and see what he says. I know through this programme that he's heard my name and my story. Why are children being given to paedophiles through the family courts, David?
Whoa. Well, I talked about this a little bit on a previous programme about 2 ago. But you see, this is the challenge that I have, given where I'm coming from, is that to answer a question like that, you have to start talking about things which many people, in fact, not the vast majority listen to this program, I'm sure, but the vast majority of the public will just look at you, as my mother used to say, they look at me gone out. They look at me gone out, Dave. In other words, they look at me real strange and say, you are joking.
Yeah.
Because the question of why do they give children to paedophiles comes with another question. why are there so many pedophiles? Why are there so many pedophiles, for instance, in the so-called upper echelons of society? And I can't go into detail on the time we've got, but I mentioned a little while ago that in the end, if you keep going down the rabbit hole, if you keep going into this core, this cabal, you eventually not just go out of the public eye into the shadows, you go into other dimensions of reality, and you're dealing with other entities that are not human, entities that feed off human energy. These entities, you could think of these entities as a distortion, or distorted energy fields. And a distortion can, because everything's a frequency and can only absorb its own frequency band, because like radio stations can only connect with the stations on their own frequency, they can't interact with stations on a different frequency. For something in a state of distortion, the frequency of distortion, if you like, to absorb energy, it has to be able to absorb energy that's in a similar state of distortion. It cannot absorb energy that's in a state of balance and harmony. So because these entities are feeding off human energy, human emotional energy particularly, they have to feed off emotional energy, human energy that's in the frequency band that it can absorb, within the frequency band of the distortion that it is. And thus, they've created a society in which we have maximum fear, anxiety, stress, terror, suffering, trauma, because depression, because they are states of emotional distortion, i.e., energetic distortion from the state of balance and harmony, which is our natural order, our natural state, staggering when you look at the world. But the world is as it is, not because it's meant to be like that, but because it's been distorted by this distorted hijacker, if you like, this hijacking force. And thus it feeds off the energy generated by humans as a result of humans having the experience in the society that's been created and manipulated. And it feeds off human energy as a result of that. Now, it became clear over the years that this cabal is made up of hybrid bloodlines that are part human and part this force. They have dual DNA, if you like. One part of them exists in this reality. That's why we see them as human. Another part of them exists in the unseen, which is why we don't see their real selves, except sometimes people do. And they don't look anything like human. And so these particular bloodlines are this force, which some people call archons, some people call jinn, the Islamic world calls them jinn, all over the world, there's different names, but it's the same force. When we see these leaders manipulating the world, what is actually happening, we're seeing this force through a human form manipulating the world. And what's become clear over the years is there's one particular energy that these entities want to feed off more than any other. And that's the energy of children before puberty. Because we see puberty as a hormonal change, but actually it's an energetic change which manifests as a hormonal change. They want the energy of children before that change takes place. And thus, these particular bloodlines I've just described, these hybrids, there is the most extraordinary ratio of pedophiles among those bloodlines, for the reason that they are vehicles for these entities in the unseen, feeding off the energy of children while the sexual act is taking place. And therefore, there is a pedophile mafia that operates in the upper echelons of society and down into society in general. There are lots of gopher pedophiles as well as the ones from these elite bloodlines. And they operate as a mafia, watching each other's back. Because if one goes, they all go. why was Savile protected so blatantly over decades and decades and decades? Because if he went down, the whole story, or massive amounts of the story, would start to come out, because he wouldn't have gone quietly had he been collared. And so when someone like Greville Janner is in danger of being exposed, the system gets behind him. This is why Ted Heath, not just a prime minister of this country and a paedophile extraordinaire, but also a Satanist and mass killer of children, this is why he was protected. And I named him 7 years before he died in a book called The Biggest Secret. And it's a mafia where everyone watches everyone else's back. So, you never mind Labour Party paedophiles and Republican Party paedophiles and Democrat paedophiles and conservative paedophiles. Forget the labels. They're all part of this mafia. And this mafia goes into the legal profession. It goes into the judiciary, goes into the medical profession, etc. And so, and it goes, my God, it goes into social services. I mean, what if you're a pedophile network, if you're a pedophile mafia, and you want an insatiable or an unlimited access to children, which of course you would, then you want to get involved in the school system. You want to get involved in the children's home system, and you want to get involved in social services, which is dictating ever more blatantly and outrageously where children go. The reason that more and more children, fantastic numbers now, are being taken from loving parents for the most outrageous reasons and given to foster parents, and in cases taken from mothers and given to paedophile fathers, is because the paedophile mafia ensures that goes on. This is why it's only the small fry that ever go to jail when these great, North Wales paedophile scandals in the children's homes and so-called care homes comes to light, and the people behind them never do, the famous names. Because the higher you are in this mafia, then the more that mafia is going to protect you. And that's what protected Savile. And that's what was desperately trying to protect Greville Janner. And although it's going to go to court in one form, and hallelujah to that, he's not going to go down for it, for this dementia that suddenly came out.
That's right.
So this is how it works. And this is why the most inexplicable decisions are made by the judiciary to give children to blatantly paedophile fathers at the expense of mothers and so forth. It's because of this mafia that has massive influence in the judiciary. I mean, when these look at North Wales, look at how that's been covered up, no matter how many inquiries they've had. I mean, look at this situation with the Theresa May inquiry, and how they kept proposing the most outrageously inappropriate people to run it and to head it,
and to cover it up, yeah.
And had to drop them out of the sheer incredulity of people. Like, what are you putting that person of all people in charge for? This is the mafia at work, trying to cover the tracks.
We are up on time, would you believe? We're going to be kicked out now any second, so we're going to have to leave it there for now. But of course, you'll be back when you're good and ready to come back. You're always welcome. People, okay, get on to davidicke.com. Go to davidicke.com/headlines. I've recommended many times The Perception Deception. I will recommend it again. It's absolutely brilliant. And I always like to get the opportunity to say publicly, thanks for singing about this programme and talking about it and talking it up, because it's very good that you do that, David. Thank you very much for that.
It's a pleasure, Rich. Enjoyed it. Thanks.
Fantastic, mate. We'll talk again really soon. David Icke on the line to us there from the Isle of Wight.